Hey there, I'm Christopher Schoenwald, and welcome to Life as a show intently focused on helping people find their professional pathway by exploring and unearthing the details of jobs from around the world. Space travel, life in space. What does that mean to you? I was thinking the other day that there's about a handful of topics that, broadly speaking, attract interest, to most people. And we all have our own things, what we're interested in, what we're not interested in. But I think this topic, or these topics here, appeal to a lot of people. I mean, for a lot of different reasons, right? It's a world that most of us are probably never going to experience. And, we don't have a ton of exposure to it outside of maybe some movies and whatnot. So in the spirit of this show, I thought it'd be pretty interesting to speak to someone who knows intimately about this entire field. And that's what I've done. I have this excellent guest lined up for us today who's lived in space. He's commanded the International Space Station. He was a NASA astronaut. And we have this really interesting conversation where we dive into kind of the obvious sort of questions a lot of people might have about, what's the training like, preparing for a flight in space? What is it like living in space? But also, we get into some conversations around things like conflict in space. Sometimes we have these geopolitical issues on Earth, say between Russia and the US. What's it like when you're living in this tin can floating around Earth, right? With people from these countries that, back on Earth, people aren't really getting along so well. So we kind of dive into that stuff. And also to topics such as, how life in space, that whole experience affects you years later. We dive into things like that and a whole lot more. So let me more formally introduce you to him, and then we'll get into it. So Terry Virts is a retired U.S. Air Force test fighter pilot. Not only that, he is a NASA veteran of 2 spaceflights and a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy, Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, and Harvard Business School. That said, he is an outlier in the truest sense. His professional background, career, accomplishment, and present-day work varies to the point that attempts to pigeonhole him into one title is a near futile endeavor. And trust me, I've tried. And take his LinkedIn About section description, which reads as follows. I'm a founder of Endeavour Renewable Energy, a company that will produce renewable diesel, hydrogen, electricity, biochar, and graphene. I'm also developing several TV and film projects and have authored several books, How to Astronaut and National Geographic's View from Above. I'm a guest lecturer at Harvard Business School and the USC School of Cinematic Arts and speak at corporate and public events around the globe, sharing stories and leadership perspectives from my time in space. Finally, I serve on several boards as an advisor. Yeah, you see what I mean? Well, all this adds up to fascinating insights and perspectives that are hard to come by. Surely, not too many of us have been a U.S. Air Force test fighter pilot, an astronaut, or been put in charge of an international space station as a commander. So for all these reasons and many, many more, it's an absolute honor to welcome you to the program. How are you doing, Terry?
Good. Thanks for having me on. I'm not sure when I wrote that LinkedIn thing. I'll have to see if I need to update it.
It sounds pretty good to me. I don't know. Yeah. Again, thanks for taking some time and joining the program. Really excited for many, many reasons. And I think listeners are really going to appreciate this. With that in mind, maybe we'd just jump right into things here. I do have the first segment lined up. It's something called Coloring Wikipedia. As my listeners would know, it's just a segment where I read off a definition of the person's job, or sometimes their industry. And I like to do it for a couple of reasons. One, it brings everybody up to speed on what the person does. But then also, two, I think it's a really nice point to look at the profession itself and kind of examine it from different viewpoints. So, of course, I do have you down here as an astronaut. I know you're involved in several different projects as well, but I think a lot of them probably stem from your earlier work. You would probably agree with that. So let me just read that off. And from there, I can ask your perspectives on the definition itself. Does that sound all right?
Yeah, let's jump in.
Okay, here we go. So, astronaut. An astronaut, from the ancient Greek astron, meaning star, and nautis, meaning sailor, is a person trained, equipped, and deployed by a human spaceflight program to serve as a commander or crew member aboard a spacecraft. Although generally reserved for professional space travelers, the term is sometimes applied to anyone who travels into space, including scientists, politicians, journalists, and tourists. And I also grabbed this too, NASA candidacy requirements. For being an astronaut, let me just read those off quickly as well. The candidate must be a citizen of the US. The candidate must complete a master's degree in a STEM field, including engineering, biological science, physical science, computer science, or mathematics. The candidate must have at least 2 years of related professional experience obtained after degree completion or at least 1,000 hours pilot in command time on a jet aircraft. The candidate must also be able to pass the NASA long-duration flight astronaut physical. The candidate must also have skills in leadership, teamwork, and communications. A bit of a mouthful, stumbled through it a little bit, but first take, what do you think of this, Eric?
Well, I think that job description's been there for a long time for NASA. The big thing, if you want to be a NASA astronaut, is you need a technical degree, some type of math or science or engineering. I was a math major, applied math, and I was also a French minor. And then the master's degree thing sounds new. I think it used to be you either need the master's degree or the 1,000 hours of jet time. Because I was the pilot. I was not the the scientist kind of guy. But that's the NASA minimum requirements. Now most people have like more than just the minimums, obviously. But there's other ways to be an astronaut nowadays. You can go make a lot of money, and that's
true enough.
That's the other qualification. So there are different paths, but for me, NASA was the thing that I wanted to do. I mean, I loved, the Apollo missions, and I wanted to fly the space shuttle, and so that was my own personal journey.
Yeah, and I think we're going to get into that in a little bit, but that's interesting. That's a good point that you raised too about the private sector getting involved, because that's certainly been one of the biggest, additions to this whole sort of realm. I would say in the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah. I laugh. People are like, well, finally normal people can go into space. And I'm like, right. Obviously I'm not a normal person, grew up in like middle-class America. I was the first person to go to college, finally normal people like Elon or like, Jeff Bezos can go to space.
Right.
So it's a funny definition, but the fact that more people can go to space is very cool. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. Well, we're certainly entering into a different phase, and it feels as though, correct me if I'm wrong here, but there seemed like for a little while there was a bit of a lull in maybe the interest a little bit. It was waning, from when the space programs had originally started, and then it kind of just got normal. And I'm finger quoting this for those who can't see. But in the last, again, 5-10 years, it feels as though there's been more articles, just even in my feed, whether it's a social feed or going to news sites, there are more articles. In fact, in the last week, I feel, there's been 2 or 3 that just keep popping up, and maybe it's that my radar's turned on to all of this in preparing for this talk, but all the same, I think there's something to that.
Yeah, there is. Well, there's definitely, if you want to follow space, you can get 24/7 space content. If you want to follow the Kardashians, you can get 24/7 Kardashian content. Whatever it is that you're interested in, Ukraine, you can get all the content you want. And when I was a kid, I wish we had this. I got Astronomy magazine, and I had to wait every month. My astronomy would show up, and I'd read the whole thing in a day, and then I'd have to wait another month for the next magazine. Well, now you get Astronomy magazine, every day or every hour, some content like it. So it's a plus and a minus, I think, of our modern world, is that if there's something you're interested in, you can get lots of it, which is great, but you're not going to hear other things happening. You're not going to get other points of view, which is pretty dangerous in other ways. But
most definitely, that's a whole different podcast, really. But
or 5.
Yeah, right. I'm completely with you on all of that, though.
Yeah.
In terms of, I guess, getting back to this notion of being an astronaut, what would you say some of the biggest misconceptions about it? I'm sure there's so many, but maybe for some, even for myself, like when you consider it, or a young person, even an adult, you have a few sort of images in your mind. Maybe it's the white space suit that you're wearing, the shuttle itself, floating in space. There's a few things that, most people would kind of attach to that job or profession. But beyond that, what would you say in terms of these misconceptions of it all?
Well, I was at NASA for 16 years, and I spent about half a year in space, and the other 15 and a half years I was on the ground. And so the astronauts we just hired a few years ago are already flying in space. So those guys have it pretty good. But the majority of your time as an astronaut is not in space. It's on the ground, either training or doing other jobs, helping NASA in lots of different ways, working at Mission Control, working on the new rockets we have coming up, or there's a lot of ground jobs you have. So probably the biggest misconception is that all you do is fly in space, and that's not.
Mm.
We wish that's what it was, but that's not what
Yeah.
it is. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. No, that's a really good point. And I think that sort of leads into a question later on that we're going to get into. But before that, maybe we can meander over into this other segment here, Terry. It's something called Pathways. And it's a
Mhm.
segment that I set up in the last 3 or 4 months. And basically, it's inspirational in nature. And it kind of tries to show that most pathways, career pathways, that is, aren't this linear sort of line
Yeah.
straight to where you want to go. Maybe it's different for you, but I know in your book, How to Astronaut, you certainly spell a lot of this out. But for those who haven't read the book yet, and I certainly encourage everybody to go grab a copy of that because it's absolutely fascinating. Maybe you could share with listeners a little bit, how you ended up into space or on a
Yeah.
career path to where you've ended up now.
Yeah. My journey was as a pilot. There's different like flavors of astronaut. There's different categories of NASA astronaut. There's engineers, there's medical doctors, there's scientists, there's pilots. And so there's a few different like categories they put you in.
Yeah.
Back in the shuttle program, you were either a pilot or mission specialist. Now the capsules are automated. There really isn't much, if any, piloting to do. So everybody is an astronaut. So when I was a kid, I knew I wanted to be an astronaut. I grew up with posters of galaxies and the space shuttle and even an F-16 on my wall. I knew I wanted to do it, but I didn't know how. And as a teenager, a family friend told me that I should read The Right Stuff. And it's a book that Tom Wolfe wrote. It's about the early astronauts, the Mercury, the first 7 astronauts. And it's the best book. It's just a spectacular book. Definitely a bygone era, but that showed me the path. It was these guys have been fighter pilots and then test pilots and then astronauts. And so that's what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And that was the path that I ended up taking. So that's how I took that. But the key thing is, figure out your path and then figure out a way to do it. If it's something you really want to do, words are very easy, but if you really want to accomplish something, it's going to require more than words. You're going to have to actually come up with a plan to get there.
Well, it sounds like to me, I mean, from that vision, in your youth, it sounds like, well, this is the line I want to go on, and this is where I'm going to go. Were there any moments along that journey, though, in terms of, achieving what you wanted to achieve, where it wasn't going as smoothly as you'd hoped, perhaps, and you had to kind of like jump off that line, go onto a different path and then maybe rejoin? Or was it more or less like, well, there's the goal and you're...
Before I was an astronaut, I was very lucky. I was one of the youngest Air Force Academy grads. I think there's only a handful out of 1,000 that were younger than me. When I got to test pilot school, I was probably the youngest pilot there. When I got to NASA, I was definitely the youngest pilot, one of the youngest they had in the whole shuttle program. So I was very fortunate up to that point in my career where I kind of was getting things right away. It wasn't like I was a straight A student. It wasn't like I was the number one graduate from everything. I wasn't. Things went fast. And then I got to NASA, and then they really slowed down. Then it was a decade before my first flight. So once I got to NASA, because there had been some shuttle problems, they hired too many astronauts. They had the Columbia accident, which was the 20th anniversary this week. So all these things happened to really slow things down. And then I have a post-NASA career we can talk about if you want that was very, very, very different. I think we'll talk about that later. So I had a weird life, I guess, in that the first half, everything was really fast.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, everything slowed down and changed.
Okay. Really returning to that point where things were going very quickly for you.
Yeah.
Was there any particular reasoning for that? Were you just being, flagged or identified as having exceptional skills or abilities or?
No, I mean, the reality is there's a lot of smart fighter pilots in the Air Force. There's a lot of smart and talented test pilots. I think one thing from my application that stood out was that I spoke French. I had done an exchange at the French Air Force Academy as a cadet. In fact, I was there last week, been an exchange student in Finland. And so I had this international experience that very few Air Force fighter pilots do. And so I think that really made me stand out. The chief astronaut at the time had also done the same French exchange when he was at the Academy 10 years before me. So that didn't hurt. But a lot of times in life, it requires a little bit of luck. To get your big break is going to require some luck. The key is that you're prepared for it when it happens. When this guy had took the job of chief astronaut and he was looking through applications, I had already done my French Air Force Academy exchange. I had already done all the things that I needed to do. So I was able to take advantage of it. But the more prepared you are, the luckier you get. That's an old saying. And I think there's something to that.
Most definitely. I mean, it sounds like a series of serendipitous sort of moments, but like you said, I mean, the positioning of yourself to be in that moment where you can take advantage, is certainly a big part of it. And also too, it returns to that point as well of, your application perhaps and how it was viewed outside of just the skill of learning a different language, I'm sure, which is much appreciated and highly valued, but it also probably speaks to the drive of you and sort of your views, your worldviews as well. And that might have been an appealing point. And again, it's probably a point that we're going to get into later in this talk, but it speaks to that too. And I would imagine that was probably highly valued just as much as the skill itself of being able to communicate in a foreign language. So,
yeah, well, that's good. I think I probably have more confidence than I have skill. So there's something to be said for that. A lot of times they'll say, like men are overconfident, but they're not really that good. And women are really good, but they're not as confident. And I don't know if that's a man or woman thing, or if it's just whatever. I probably have more confidence than ability. But that's, you know what, in life, if you have a brain that you can learn and you can be flexible, then the confidence is really the main thing.
Sure is. No, that's a really good point. All right. Well, maybe we could shift on over to a different segment here, Terry. It's a Q&A discovery. I mean, basically continue this back and forth. And, in terms of your book, getting back to this book, How to Astronaut, there's so many jaw-dropping moments and I was awestruck throughout. But one of the things, or one of the sections within there that sort of got me was in relation to the trainings of becoming, an astronaut. And of course, you had things like procedural trainings, space assimilation trainings, something called a vomit comet, training simulating emergencies, as well as survival training. All these things kind of come to mind. And maybe you could speak to a few of these points if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, the book How to Astronaut I got one copy right here. It was 51 basically short essays. There are 5, 6, 7-page chapters about 51 random aspects of spaceflight. So like you said, some of them are expected, like how do you train for launch on a shuttle, or how do you do medical training? I was the crew medical officer, so I'm not a doctor, but that was my job on the station. And then some of them were not expected, like what do you do with a dead body if your crewmate dies, or have people or have they not in space, whatever. So I wanted the goal, at least I don't know if I'm answering a question, that for the book was to make people say wow and laugh. And without, it's not for space nerds, it's for anybody. I tried to make a book that was very much for anybody, but just to make it more accessible, because space is obviously something that people are very interested in. Lots of people are, and it's a little bit intimidating. So I tried to bring it down to the masses. And I also wrote it myself, which is, I think, pretty unusual for space books. Most have some type of ghostwriter. My goal was to write it myself.
You checked a lot of the boxes you were just mentioning. As I said, I mean, it was quite engaging, for myself. And again, I would certainly encourage everybody to go grab a copy of that book, because it is accessible, and allows you to kind of get this peek behind the curtain, if you will, of, what it takes to become an astronaut. In returning to some of those points about the trainings, procedural trainings or emergency trainings, or even some of these survival trainings, is there anything you could sort of add or just sort of like tease the audience with that?
When I was an F-16 pilot, I remember I had this one mission in Korea. I was leading a 4-ship. There was 4 jets. I was the lead. It was low altitude at night. At the time, we had this system that we flew at low altitude at night, and we had bad enemy bandits pretending to be MiG-29s. And we landed. I remember thinking, that's as busy as a human being can be. I'm flying my jet. Their ground is right there. It's nighttime. I got to keep track of my 4 guys. I got to keep track of these MiGs coming in. We got to put laser guided bombs on the target. That was the most busy that a human being could be in my brain. And then I got to NASA and flew the shuttle. And during ascent, especially as a pilot and the commander, there is so much going on. And the simulator instructors would just throw way too many malfunctions. That would never happen in real life. But what they were trying to do was just max out your brain, stress you out as much as they could, so that on the real day, you're not going to have 20 different malfunctions, but you are going to have a rocket launching, which is going to stress you out in its own way. So the big thing about the training that was really important was to stress your brain out emotionally as much as you can, because in the real, when you really fly, you're going to be stressed out in a different way. But it was, I guess, the closest we could come to stress. And they they push you to the limit. A really high functioning crew and a really high functioning mission control team with the flight director and the flight controllers. That was a thing of beauty to watch that in operation during the shuttle.
Yeah, I bet. And it must have been one thing too to be like even aware of the reasoning behind this. Of course, you're probably in the moment. You know what they're doing. You know the reasoning behind it, but still trying to to get through it and to manage those emotions and to really train yourself in that sense and mentally compartmentalize. And it must have been. Yeah.
It was definitely a full-time job being a space shuttle pilot.
Yeah, most definitely. It sounds like it. Well, maybe we shift over into another question here. Speaking of the mental side of the work that you've done and in relation to that job, it would seem to me that there's certain traits that somebody like yourself, an astronaut, would be hardwired with or would need to be hardwired with to be successful within space. I mean, there's a couple of things that come to mind. I mean, just, intelligence, creativity, maybe open-mindedness, diligence, extroverted personality. I mean, those are things that sort of pop into my mind. But is there anything you'd like to add to that or you perhaps take away?
No, those are good. You don't have to be an extrovert. There's plenty of there's astronaut introverts, but I think your ability to be flexible and learn new things, that was my favorite part of the job. It wasn't the same thing every day, but it was a perfect job for an ADD person like myself, because every day you're doing different stuff. You're doing maintenance on mechanical things. You're doing science experiments. Some days you're unloading or loading cargo ships, which is a huge job. Some days you're doing spacewalks. Some days you're doing interviews, media interviews, getting ready to go back to Earth, every day, exercise every day, medical procedures on yourself. So every day was something different. And so if you're the kind of person that likes to work on the accounts receivable spreadsheet at your office all day, every day, then astronaut's not the job for you. But if you don't mind sitting at the desk for a little bit, but then you want to get up and get around and and do different things, that might be the job for you.
Yeah. Well, the one that I had listed off there, that extroverted personality, it was interesting that you said that that's not a requirement. The reason I'd put that down, or I thought, is just like it's a contained space. Obviously, you got to be working as a team. You got to be together, on things wholly. If you had somebody that was more within themselves and didn't really enjoy being as social with others, I would assume that would be a bit of a challenge at times in achieving something. But no,
maybe the most important skill is your interpersonal, which doesn't mean you have to be loud in the life of the party, which I associate with that. But in fact, those are not the people you want. It was funny. We did this all day psychological test when I was interviewing to be an astronaut a long time ago. And I remember afterwards, they were like, man, you got the best score. They loved my personality. And remember the Briggs-Myers personality inventory? That was something, I don't know if they do it. I did it, a long time ago. And there are these 4 different areas, and mine was always in the middle. I never had like strong ESTP or INFJ, whatever the letters were. I was always kind of a little of one and a little of the other.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good place to be for space crews, because the really strong personality guy is kind of fun at the party or at the bar. But like, if you have to live in the same can all day, every day, that could get a little bit tiresome. So being able to just kind of roll with the punches and not be too uptight about anything. When I looked at applications in the last months of my time at NASA, my last task was to help with their selection of the last astronaut class. Well, now, maybe 2 astronaut classes ago, I looked for people who, the most important skill is to be able to get along with other people. There's a lot, you have to be competent. You have to be able to have a level of technical competence, of course. But then beyond that, the differentiator is your personality, I think.
Yeah. That's one of the reasons I wanted to build that into this discussion, because I think that it would have to be one of the most critical elements outside, of course, the technical elements of it all. Yeah, it's interesting to hear, though, nonetheless. In terms of your time in space, I'm sure there's so many different moments there from an outsider's perspective that would, not force you, but encourage you to think, existentially on a number of different topics or a number of different things. And, human life and living, all that stuff, looking down on our planet. I'd love to know the impacts that it's had on you as a person from your time in space.
I think a lot of people call that the overview effect. How does it change you when you see the planet? Well, the first thing is, I can remember this moment where it just like hit me that I'm in outer space and my planet's over there. I mean, that's a pretty powerful moment. Like I'm not on my planet anymore. There's Earth and I'm not there.
That sorry
Um,
to interrupt really quickly, but I
yeah,
mean, like that's the origin of this question right there, is because there's so much imagery of that,
yeah,
from the International Space Station looking down on planet Earth. And those images are absolutely stunning,
hmm
absolutely stunning. But also, too, at the same time, like I could not imagine actually being the person taking that photo or sitting within the space station, not sitting,
yeah,
floating within the space station and looking down, and what that experience would be like, aside from the beauty, like how
yeah.
that would actually hit you, and affect you. So
Y-
sorry to
y-
interrupt there, but
No, no, no. It's true. You can't imagine. Like I had imagined a lot. I had read all the
yeah,
books. I had seen all the movies. I was in the astronaut office for a decade talking to my colleagues. But when I first saw the first sunrise I saw was like overpowering. As we went into the sunrise, all the frozen liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen broke apart from the fuel lines when they closed up, and we were flying in this cloud of ice going into sunrise. And as the sun was shining on it, it was like thousands of sparkling flying things. It was insane how powerful it was. And then just looking out at the sunrise and looking down as we flew over the Alps upside down, I had to like really focus. I remember my commander Zambo was like, "Hey Terry, are you with me?" Because I was like, "Look at that, man, it's awesome." And I was like, "Yeah, I'm with you, Zambo," because I had to fly the shuttle. I had to deal with like seeing the most spectacular thing you've ever seen, and then
yeah,
get back to work because I'm flying the space shuttle. Yeah, it was pretty awesome, and I had a whole 7 months of that. 2 weeks on my first flight, 200 days on my second flight, and I've written several books about it. I did a couple movies. There's an IMAX movie called A Beautiful Planet I helped make.
yeah.
But you were right. Unless you actually see it with your own eyeballs in space,
Mm.
you just can't imagine it.
Yeah, fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. In terms of, I guess, like the impact that that's had on your life now, here you've transitioned to a second, third, fourth, fifth career and all the different
Yeah.
projects that you're doing. What degree of influence would you say some of those sort of experiences have had on the way that you view the world itself now, or the
Yeah.
types of projects that you're attracted to?
I think it really informed like a big picture. I'm not nearly as black and white as I used to be. I think when
Mm,
you're young, it's easy for everything to be black and white, and this is right and that's wrong, and this is good and that's bad.
good point.
And most things are gray. They're not black and white. Some stuff's black and white. What's happening in Ukraine is black. It's not white, right? That's evil. There is evil in the world for sure. But in most situations, I can kind of see both sides, and I'm not nearly as uptight. I hope anyway. And I think the just that philosophy can inform everything you do in life. Like try and see things from other people's perspective, and don't have your preconceived notion. It's also really hard to be impressed with celebrity when you've seen the universe.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm impressed with the things that people do. I've got a good friend working on a malaria vaccine at Brown University. I had him on my podcast, Down to Earth with Terry Virts. That impresses me. Or things
Mm,
like what you're doing, just people that are spreading good in the world. That's what
yeah.
impresses me, as opposed to we kind of have this celebrity worship culture. The royal family, my God, that's the worst example of those poor people. Like I'm sure they're good, decent human beings, but they're hounded constantly, right? So
uh, yeah.
I would love to meet Kate and William and just have a beer or whatever. They have a
Right.
pint or whatever, but I don't want to hound them, and I don't want to know what color dress, blah, blah, blah. The celebrity thing is definitely not at the top of your list after, after being in space. I don't think. Yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah. Well, that's probably a nice sort of impact that it's had, because I think
Yeah.
that's you're right, and it's something that probably a lot of us could pull back on to a certain degree. Some of that fascination there. As far as your interest within the environment, some of those issues surrounding those points. Again, floating in space, looking down at the beauty of what the world offers,
Yeah.
and acknowledging a lot of the challenges we're facing right now with climate crisis issues and everything else, and some
Yeah.
of the projects that you're showing interest in right now. For that point in particular, would you say that's also been influenced by your time up there?
Well, for sure. Though, I mean, when you look out the window, it's just anecdotal. That's just your eyes. If you want to see climate change, you need a spreadsheet with 100 years of data. So
Yeah,
you can't see that. You can't see
yeah,
change. You can only see one moment in time. The movie we made, A Beautiful Planet, Tony Myers directed it, Jennifer Lawrence narrated it. it's a well-titled movie. It is a beautiful planet. I mean, when you look at Earth, it's not a disaster. It's absolutely spectacular.
Yeah. Yeah.
Except for me, there were two issues. China and India, to a lesser extent, were very smoggy and muggy and just brown. You could tell it was really brown in northeast China, where Beijing is. And then India was very smoggy too. The other environmental challenge I saw was deforestation. And you could see that in the Amazon on days when the clouds aren't there, which is not very often. Also, Madagascar, the Belgians back in the 1950s and 60s just chopped down about 90% of Madagascar. It was a rainforest island, and now there's a little strip of rainforest in the east. Those were the environmental problems I saw. And when you look at the planet, I've got some pictures here in my studio. There's this thin blue line, and that's our atmosphere.
Yeah.
And above it, there's never going to be any human being ever that's from above that line. Everybody is from Earth and always will be from Earth, at least in our solar system. There's no planet where you can live without spaceships and spacesuits. And so it really struck me that we have planet A and there's no planet B.
That's a really good point. And that's kind of what I was getting at with that question is that, I mean, the impact that must have is profound. Like
it was profound for me. I'm going to make this point. It maybe is a real bummer, but we have to acknowledge it. Yeah. 3 of the people I flew with, I flew on 2 different missions, a 2-week shuttle and a 200-day Soyuz space station with Russian cosmonauts on both flights. Mm-hmm. And I loved Russia. I love the people and the culture. I really enjoyed my time there. We worked together. It's been a really good partnership for over 20 years now, almost 30 years on the space station.
Yep.
And 3 of the cosmonauts that I flew with are now in the Duma. They're congressmen in Russia promoting the war. Wow. Promoting the war. So these are men and women. There's 2 men and 1 woman that I flew with who should be the most enlightened people on Earth. They spent months and months of their lives off the planet, and yet they're promoting that evil genocide in Ukraine. And so a lot of people think, well, if you could just fly Trump and Putin into space, when they came back, they'd be Trump and Putin. So to be, or whatever, some people are changed. Some people are thoughtful. I think if you're disposed to be open-minded and learn new things, I think space can profoundly affect you. But if you're not, then it won't. So I think one of the most important things is sending people to space would be great. I think sending them on foreign exchanges on Earth as kids, like if every 16-year-old went and lived in a different country, we'd have a better planet in 20 years or 30 years,
Yeah.
Going to space is not the be all end all. I used to think it was, and I have 3 data points now that show that it's not.
I like that the point about, the willingness, I suppose, of putting yourself out there or allowing yourself to consider these things. I myself, this program is produced out of Japan. I've been in Japan for, this January is 20 years now.
Oh, wow.
And
where in Japan?
Western Japan. So I'm in a small little town on the inland sea.
On Hokkaido or Honshu?
No, down closer to, say, Hiroshima, not within Hiroshima Prefecture, but fairly close. I'd say an hour and a half in the bullet train away from there. But a tiny little town. And, in these 20 years, I've met people that are quite gregarious and, embrace the culture and learn everything as much as they can. And it's funny, you meet some other people who you would think that they come here for those reasons, but they keep to themselves and they don't really fully embrace it. And they don't really get all that involved. They don't speak the language, although they've been here for years and years. And it's just interesting, like you said, kind of returning to that point of people. And, you have to have that willingness, I suppose, to be open to all these different ideas that are about, around you.
Yeah. So. Some people really profit from that and some don't. Yeah. I just saw the most amazing thing today. It was a Japanese 10,000 person chorus. The conductor was Shanturo, something like that. They were playing Beethoven. It was the most spectacular thing I've ever seen.
Yeah.
What's the baseball team? Is Hiroshima your baseball team?
It'd be the closest one, the Carp, Hiroshima Carp.
The Carp.
Yeah. And then like the fans here are absolutely fanatical about it. It'd be like the equivalent of, say, the NFL within the States, like how diehard those fans are. That's what pro baseball is like over here. Yeah.
I went to a Tokyo Giants game and a Chiba Latte Marines,
Yeah.
In what town is that?
So the Giants are out of Tokyo,
Yeah.
and then Chiba is just outside of Tokyo. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was more like a college football because they got a band and every
Yeah.
player has their own song, and it was the most awesome. And it's
Yeah.
very uniform. It's very Japanese, right? Like everybody
Exactly.
does the same thing at the same time.
You got it. You got it. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, every day,
I love it.
yeah. It's an interesting culture. And again, kind of speaks to the point of being here for 20 years. I mean, every day, you never know what you're going to get every day. And that's kind of
Yeah.
what the allure of it is for myself, at least. And anyway, I digress a little bit here, but
I love
yeah.
okonomiyaki.
Yeah. Oh yeah. The food is awesome. I mean, the food is another reason, perhaps, I'm still here. It tastes great and it's super healthy. So yeah, you really can't go wrong. It kind of sucks you in, this place, and it keeps you here. That's for certain. But maybe returning to our talk a little bit here really quickly. I could go, and again, that'd be a whole different podcast too. I could go on to, but
the Japan could be a series of podcasts.
Oh yeah, most definitely. I guess returning to that point of what we were just speaking of in terms of the relationships with people, with one another within space. What strikes me is that you certainly have missions, you have different experiments, you have reasons for being there, obviously.
Right.
And you're working with these teams of people that are coming from different cultures that you just mentioned, different ethnicities, backgrounds, all these different things. And in a way, say that time within an International Space Station, it's almost a microcosm of how life should be, perhaps, here on Earth. Whether it's within an organization, a business, a school, whatever it might be. I'd be curious to hear, your perspectives on that and maybe what you tell others about that.
Yeah. I've been speaking, like I put bread on the table by doing public speaking. And for the last 5, 6, 7 years since I left NASA, one of my lessons was I talked about this incident we had with an ammonia leak. In fact, the National Geographic book I wrote, View from Above, chapter 5, the whole main chapter was about this ammonia leak. Ammonia is a coolant fluid, kind of like your car radiator has cooling fluid, and it leaked, which is a deadly thing. It actually kills the space station. We thought the station was done. And the Russians said, hey, we're going to work together. We went down on the Russian segment and closed the hatch because they don't have ammonia down there. So it was a moment where we're working together with the Russians. They had already invaded Crimea. They had started the civil war in Donbass. It wasn't a civil war, it was an invasion. We had put sanctions on them. They had shot down that civilian airliner. Lots of terrible things were happening.
Yeah.
And here we were in space, and they said, hey, come stay on our side. We're going to work together. So to me, that was an example of how people can and should work together down here on Earth. That was my, the cooperation in space is great. It's really going well. And then my buddies that I spent a lot of my time with decided to go promote the war, and they used the space station to promote the war. They were recording pro-war messages on the Russian segment of the space station, and so it was like bring me back to reality, kind of gut punch, to be honest.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, were you aware of that in the moment or in that time with some of these pro-war messaging was going out, or is this something after the fact?
I gotta be honest, in high school, I was voted most gullible because I'm very trusting. I just trust people. And I was promoting, I'm like, look, the Russians they should be our friends. But I did not think they were going to invade Ukraine. I kind of thought, well, Crimea, the people in Crimea wanted to be Russia. It's not that bad. I was duped just as much as any Western politician was. When you look at what's happened, or I should have been open in the 90s when they pounded Chechnya. But certainly in 2008, when Putin just destroyed Georgia, and then when he decided to not give up power, that should have been a giant flashing warning light. And yet we just kept on appeasing them, Anyway, so my eyes were not as open as they should have been anytime a dictator, authoritarian kind of guy is killing journalists and jailing opposition leaders and keeping himself in power forever, it's always himself. The warning lights need to go on. So hopefully our eyes are wide open now. And although it's more fun to talk about space, it's more fun to go, how are we going to land on the moon? How can we get to Mars? The reality is we all live down here on Earth, and we need to get that straight too. These kind of conflicts don't grow.
Certainly. Had you been aware of something like that going on within, the space station, some of that messaging coming out at that time, it surely would have been a delicate situation, no less. I mean, this is something that we hadn't spoken about, but conflict? How do you manage it? How do you deal with
Yeah.
it? How do you be mature about it? Because again, you're up there for some of these missions that are stretching out for months on end, and you can't have divide, right? Like,
No, the way we handled it, well, I was right in the middle of this. And what we would do is we would say, hey guys, politics is politics. We're gonna focus on trying to stay alive,
yeah,
trying to not die during this ammonia leak. We're gonna work together. And everybody kind of agreed. And there was a warning signs. One of my Russian, well, like I said, several of them are now on the Duma, and one of them was a big Crimea's Krim nash. Crimea's ours is what he was saying. And it wasn't as bad. Crimea was kind of a bloodless coup. They came in, they called them Vejlivi Ludi, which means polite people. Like their army came in, they took their Russian badges off, and they were just, it wasn't that terrible. If you were up there now, it is that terrible. It would be really, I think, strained. And the astronauts are professional people. They've done a great job staying professional. I think the leaders on the ground have not done a great job, but the crew in space has done, I think, a very good job. Just going, hey guys, let's keep the space station running, and let's not, have some tragedy. And we'll let we can't. The reality is they can't change the war, so just get your job done. Just do your job and come back to Earth. But
yeah, well, maybe this might be a nice point to segue into this middle segment here, something called the water cooler story. And to be honest, I mean, you've shared a couple stories already, but I'd be curious if you had something, another brief one for us really quickly, just for this particular segment. Anything related to your time up there, or anything's popping to your mind right now?
Yeah, I've got a million stories I could tell. Well, I had this one incident. I was outside on a spacewalk, and man, I thought I'd been a fighter pilot and test pilot. I thought I had done a bunch of stuff, space shuttle pilot. But when you're out on a spacewalk, you got this thin millimeter thick piece of plastic, and there's instant death on the other side of that plastic. So you're pretty focused. And I remember, and you're busy. You're busier than the NFL draft. You are on the clock. The clock is ticking for 8 or 9 hours. You're in the spacesuit. And so I was plugging in cables, the power and data cables for future capsules. So now, this was years ago, but when SpaceX and Boeing capsules dock, they get their power and data from the cables that I laid down. We laid down like 400 feet of cables. And so super busy. And then I had a minute. So I stopped and I kind of just rotated around to look out at the world. And I could see the sunrise. And that was like I was hearing from God, like this is God's view of creation, and humans are not supposed to see this. Yeah. It was really, really powerful. And then I had to get back to work to get back to plugging in the cables. So, and that's kind of a microcosm of spaceflight. There's the most amazing, you're floating. That's amazing. You're seeing the universe. That's amazing. And then 99% of it is just working on boxes and cleaning up and, exercising and just mundane things. I call it's a juxtaposition of sublime and mundane.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's exactly what it was like going through my head as you were just describing that. I mean, you're doing these mundane tasks. Otherwise, it would be mundane, say on Earth, laying cable or, working on these little things here and there. Not little, but some of these tasks. But the context of the whole situation, you're, as you said, floating in space and doing this, glancing over your shoulder and seeing the sunrise from space. I mean, you've got this really, like you said, juxtaposition of all these different sort of things happening all at the same time that it just must sort of mess with your mind in the best possible way, I guess. That's what I'm trying to get at. Yeah.
It really
thanks
does.
for saying that. Yeah. Well, maybe we could shift into this last segment here, Terry, something called the crystal ball segment. As the name implies, we're looking towards the future, usually trends, predictions, so on and so forth. And recently I came across this rather provocative article, or at least I thought, on the future of space exploration. And the thrust of this article was that countries, say like the US or China, who's certainly developing a lot of, their aspirations are quite well known in that realm. But the article was saying is that these countries themselves, due to this sheer amount of costs associated with space programs or just the technical sort of demands that they require, can't do it on their own. And then when you consider the world that we're living within right now and the divide, geopolitical divide, all these things going on, like, is it, feasible for us to have these dreams of having people living in space within 10 years, which have been some stated objectives by some? What would be your take on this?
Well, we've had people living in space continuously since November of 2000. It's been almost 23 years at the space station. And then before that, the Russian Mir was up from like 86 to 99, something like that. So we've had people in space now for well over most of almost 40 years. But getting into orbit is one thing. It's expensive, it's dangerous, it's difficult, but we can do that. Getting to the moon is something much different. And getting to Mars is add a zero onto that. It's much, much, much more difficult. I'm doing a talk about how to get to Mars here in a few weeks. I've got to put that together. It's a big job. But the bigger question is, should we be doing it? And we got poverty here on Earth and war in Ukraine. Why are we messing with space? Yeah. And I think that's been true ever since the 60s. There was I think a guy, it was a book or a movie. It was called Whitey on the Moon. And it was written by a black guy. And he was like, why are we worried about space when we have all these racial problems on Earth? And the reality is we're always going to have problems on Earth.
Yeah. And
so if we wait until poverty is solved and disease is solved and there's no more war and we're going to have to wait till we're in heaven, it's never going to happen. And there's a lot of benefits that come from space exploration. There's certainly a lot of inspiration that comes from space exploration. So I think it's reasonable to spend a part of what you spend. Also, the U.S. budget is much less than 0.5%, maybe 1/3%, something like that we spend on NASA. It's a very small percentage. NASA still gets a lot of money. They still get $25-ish billion. It's a lot of money.
Yeah.
And so they need to be as efficient with it as they can. But it's not like they're spending, 20% of the federal budget or something crazy like that. So I get what other people are saying. Solving the war in Ukraine is more important than the space station, honestly. Solving food security or for the next 50 years is much more important than the space station. But that doesn't mean America's a big enough and capable enough country that we can walk and chew gum. And so I think, and also partnering with other nations, the biggest benefit of the space station hasn't been the science or even the engineering. It's been the international cooperation that we've had. I think cooperating with nations that are like-minded in terms of they want to respect human rights and they want to have, promote freedom in one way or another. And there's different ways that people do things. And I'm not saying everybody has to be an American democracy, but at least you need to respect the kind of some foundational principles of the rights of humans. And I think it'd be great if we work with those nations, go into the moon and Mars and beyond. So so that's a PhD thesis topic, but those are some thoughts.
Okay. No, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, and I think one of the other things too within that article that I found interesting, but we don't have to get into right now, but I'll just mention it, was that the private sector as well, I think is probably going to play a large role. And we're seeing that unfold right now, obviously.
Yeah.
We already spoke to that to a degree, but yeah. Okay. Well, I do have one last thing here, and I do want to ask you this. I understand that you do have a book coming out this spring, and you already have 2 out right now. You released 2 already, but this one's going to be a little bit different, and it's called The Astronaut's Guide to Leaving the Planet. Yeah, maybe you could tell people a little bit about that book and what to expect from it.
Yeah, when I first had this idea, I wanted to make a book called Ask an Astronaut, and I came up with 100 questions, and I wanted to write it for kids, so like 10 to 12-year-old. It's not like a first grader kind of book, but it's not necessarily a young adult book either. So, because that's when I was really inspired. And middle school is kind of the age, elementary school, middle school, that's when you capture kids. And so reading is what got me hooked on being an astronaut. So I wanted to write something for kids. So the publisher I wrote all these questions and they said, let's turn it into a narrative. So the editor kind of helped me regroup the questions into launch. Like, this is how you launch, and this is how you live in space, and this is how you exercise. And so there's different sections of the book, but it's illustrated. And so it's, I think it's a cool book. I think the publishers did a great job. I'm on tour in the middle of April doing a little 10-city book tour, I think it is. I'm not exactly sure what date it releases. I need to get that straight, but it's coming out soon. It's been in work now for 2 years. How to Astronaut came out in September of 2020, which is like the worst imaginable time. It was before the vaccine. Nobody went. It was Christmas. You couldn't go to the mall that year. So nobody went to Barnes and Noble and like found it on the shelves and stuff. So I feel bad for the publisher, but they're going to keep that book going for 10 years. So I like writing. People are excited about space, and it was fun to, do projects to help make it more accessible.
Yeah. Oh, is that book available for pre-order right now, or?
The Astronaut's Guide, the kids book, it should be available for pre-order. My publisher is called Workman. I'm always a big fan of local bookstores, just like Sleepless in Seattle.
Yeah.
So of course you can always do Amazon, but I've encouraged people to try and find a local bookstore and support it. It was funny, that movie 30 years ago, like Barnes and Noble was the bad guys. Yeah. But now you want people to go to Barnes and Noble because even they're at risk, and Amazon's taking over the world. So, but yeah, there's a lot of different ways you can order it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for sharing that. I mean, Terry, it's been an absolute pleasure today. I mean, the time has just blown by. I can't believe we got through it all. But I've got to thank you for taking some time, one, for joining the show and just sharing all these wonderful insights. I really appreciate that.
It was fun. Great questions, and good job prepping, man. You had a lot of great prep work done.
Well, I try to set these things up for success. And I think with you, I could have had 3 questions, and somehow, some way you'd have turned it into something fantastic. So anyway, though, it's been a great time, and I really appreciate that. So for those interested in learning more about Terry and his work, of course, you can check him out on his website, terryvirts, VIRTS.com, or also on LinkedIn under Terry Virts. He's also on some of the major social platforms, Twitter @AstroTerry, on Instagram, @Astro_Terry. And for reference, all these links will be included in the show notes. And of course, too, if you like today's show, please be sure to share. It goes a long ways in terms of, getting this information out there. You can also rate, review, and subscribe, and that helps way more than you could ever know. And then finally, head on over to YouTube. I do have a channel over there I launched within the last year, and you can catch video conversations. And I do have some imagery off the top associated with the talk. So you can kind of take it in a different manner. And again, launch that within the last year. Use a bit of love. You'll notice that right away. So if you do like what you're seeing there, hit that subscribe button. It would mean a lot. And then finally, don't forget to tune into the next episode of Life as A, where we'll continue to explore and unearth the details of professions and the people behind them. I'm your host, Christopher Schoenwald. Until next time, stay curious about life and living.